Thank you. I imagine that Howard isn't perhaps such a fan of some of the course books and workbooks, especially that I've written over the years, which are full of those kind of exercises. So it goes. You have to make a living sometimes, don't you?
I've done my own as well.
I take the point. But I'm not talking about, well, I'm only actually very much in passing going to talk about course books and stuff in course books this evening. Thank you for coming, everybody who's here. Good evening. If you're in my part of the world, I live in Vienna, where we have the worst COVID situation in the world at the moment. But wherever you are, thank you for joining us. So I'm talking about free speaking, and while you were, or whether you were in the breakout rooms or whether you were not doing anything at all, I put in the chat box a couple of downloads. So these are the handouts that, well, they are the handouts for this presentation. So you should be able to go into the chat box and simply download these. These are a couple of, they're called Cambridge papers in ELT. These are a couple of papers that I wrote for Cambridge University Press and Cambridge Assessment 2 or 3 years ago. And the kinds of topics that I'm dealing with this evening are covered in these two. So the first one on the left there is looking at the management of fluency speaking activities. And the second one is more specifically about feedback on activities of this kind. They're about 15 or 16 pages long. They contain all of the kind of the academic references, and they go into more detail in terms of the kinds of practical activities that I'm talking about. So you might want to have a look at those at some point. Okay, I'm talking about oral fluency activities. So I need to be fairly clear what I'm talking about, first of all. My definitions then are that there is some kind of outcome, a non-linguistic outcome in the speaking activity. It could be simply reaching a decision together or making some kind of presentation or selling something, but there has to be a non-linguistic outcome. And this is important because so much of what we think of as oral fluency is actually display talking. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference in a while. So it's not about displaying your knowledge of the present simple, for example. It's using all of your linguistic resources to achieve something. And the second, and this is really quite simple, the second condition that needs to be met is there has to be some interaction between learners. Now, you could, of course, have extended speaking opportunities, a presentation, for example. But for me, if it's going to be fluency, it's likely to involve some interaction at some point. Perhaps not in the middle of the presentation, but at least afterwards, a presentation would be followed by some discussion. So I'm talking about these kinds of activities, and it'll become clearer, I hope, what I mean by them as I talk a little bit more. I want to start, though, by thinking back, and because teaching house, or at least Liz's teaching house, is in London, when I was thinking about this, I thought about when I was last in, well, not when I was last in London, when I last worked in London, which was from 1990 to 2000, more or less. And in 1990, I went to London, where I'm from originally, and I got a job at International House London. I started off being trained up, as they called it, as a teacher trainer, and I ended the decade as a director of studies before I left. And in those early years, I was working alongside some very, very eminent names in English language teaching. People like John Sawers, one of the authors of Headway, was one of my colleagues for a while, but practically every single coursebook writer that ever, adult coursebook writer that ever has been, was there at some point. It was quite an intimidating place. One of the most powerful memories that I had of my time there was in a staff meeting where, you know, we talk about administrative things, but also methodological issues. And there was a discussion about freer speaking activities, fluency activities. And one of the senior teachers, a teacher trainer at the time, who I won't name, said, well, yeah, I mean, once you get your students talking, there's no particular reason for you to be in the room. You know, you might as well leave. If it's better for them that you're out of the room, you might as well leave. And I thought, well, that's quite an interesting idea, that once the students are talking, you can just walk out of the room and, I don't know, pop outside and have a quick cigarette or something like that. But it was an interesting idea. And it was clearly something that was shared by quite a lot of members of the staff there. And on occasions, in the month that followed, I did set up a fluency activity, and I did pop out of the room into the corridor where I would find other colleagues just kind of hanging around and not doing very much. I'm not saying that I think that is a good idea, that once the students are talking that you leave the room, but I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea. So I was made to think about that almost 30 years ago now. And then I was thinking, what's my more recent experience of fluency activities? Well, make no secret of the fact that I've never been a fan of Zoom. I'm very well aware that it's very difficult to teach in a traditional way for any length of time, just on Zoom, and you need to use the breakout rooms, and breakout rooms kind of make sense when you're doing fluency activities. But one of the things that I realized, one of the wonderful things about Zoom, is that once you put students into breakout rooms, you can tell them that you'll be dropping in from time to time, but they'll never know. Because if you never pop into their breakout room, they'll simply assume that you're observing what's going on in another breakout room. So here's a wonderful opportunity with Zoom to do precisely what we did at International House 30 odd years ago, where you can pretend to be doing something useful, but actually be doing nothing at all. One final little anecdote, and this is concerning the end of my years at International House London when I was Director of Studies. And one of my jobs there as a Director of Studies was to deal with student complaints. And there were, every day, a whole queue of people who wanted to complain about one thing or another. And one of the common complaints, not the most common complaint, but one of the common complaints that we had to deal with was students coming in saying, the problem with the lessons is we're not learning anything. All we ever do is chat with other students. And they were suggesting, they might be catching the other students' mistakes and things like that. And they needed to be taught stuff. They wanted more grammar or more vocabulary or something of that kind. So I was wondering, in terms of the learner perception of fluency activities, how there may be a difference between how linguists, applied linguists and teachers perceive these activities and how some students perceive them. I'll just leave that hanging for the moment. Okay, so these are the kind of activities we're talking about. And before we go any further, I think it's really important that we're very clear in our own mind what is the point of these activities. And I've asked, I don't know how many groups of teachers, in-service teachers on training sessions, the same question. And the question I ask is, so what is the point of a fluency activity? And the answer that I get almost every time is, well, it's to develop fluency. And my response is, yeah, okay, fine, obviously, because if it's a fluency activity, but in what way does a spoken fluency activity promote fluency? And it's at this point that most of the time people struggle to provide an answer. So if you can't actually explain how a fluency activity promotes fluency, then there may be an issue. And I think it's worth spelling this out a little bit. So these are a slightly personalized version of an orthodoxy, I think. These activities, these spoken activities where there is a non-linguistic goal at the end, are opportunities to do the following. One, to get input from other learners. We often forget that a significant part of what's going on there is actually learning from each other. Some language acquisition theorists would argue that this is the only value in activities of this kind. Those people like Krashen who argue that it's all about input and that output doesn't really matter. So I'll take this one first. This is an opportunity to learn from other learners. And it can be a very rich source of learning. Secondly, it's an opportunity to get feedback from other learners. By this, I mean what, in a more jargonistic sense, we would call the negotiation of meaning. When you're trying to express a meaning, you have to work with your collocutor to work towards a shared understanding of what it is you're trying to express. And the person that you're talking to will typically help you to rephrase, to recode, or to clarify things, or to give you feedback on things which aren't clear. Now, at the most basic level, this might be that they give you feedback on something which you've pronounced in a way which is not comprehensible. But that kind of feedback from other learners of issues with your language production is probably far more powerful than any kind of feedback that you get from anyone else. So it's an opportunity for feedback from others. And it's likely, because this feedback is at the moment of need, it's likely to be a rich learning opportunity. Next, it's an opportunity to experiment. The kinds of exercises that Howard was talking about earlier on, these are not opportunities to experiment. They're attempts to sort of force you down a particular linguistic path and to produce language of a particular kind. You know, God, it is so hard. I mean, he gave an example of this. Examples where it's future tense. How can you force people to say will rather than might be or going to? It's really, really hard. And we push people down these little alleyways, but it's not an opportunity to experiment. Experimenting means that you have a meaning first and you want to find the language to articulate it, rather than the exercises which Howard is talking about, where you have a form and you have to try to find a meaning to fit it. So it's an opportunity to experiment and to try out all of those things which you feel perhaps that you've kind of half got on top of, but maybe not fully. And you find out, and then you get feedback whether it works or not. And that's rich, potentially so, and rewarding, potentially so. It's also an opportunity to automatize language production. By this, I mean that the way that we produce language fluently is by producing chunks at a time. We don't work on a one-by-one word basis. We don't typically, if we're speaking fluently, think in advance what we want to say in another language and then translate it into English. We need to make it even vaguely fluent. We need to produce language in chunks. And that means that those chunks have to become automatized. We have to just get used to saying little chunks of language. And it's really through fluency activities that we'll have the chance to do this. In fact, in a sense, what we mean by fluency is this automatization of language chunks. And the final reason, and possibly the most important, is that fluency activities are an opportunity to build self-confidence and motivation. If a fluency activity doesn't build self-confidence and motivation, then it's an anti-learning activity, I'm afraid. There's no point showing people what they can't do. We have to demonstrate, make it visible to learners what it is they can do. So it has to be about building self-confidence and motivation. And that means that we need to think very carefully about not just the kind of task that we're setting, but the way we manage it. So Howard talked about cognitive challenge. Well, yes, cognitive challenge is important, but if there's too much cognitive challenge, then you're not going to have much room to think about the language that's left. So I would like us to try to keep these issues in mind, the back of our mind at least, what the point of activities of this kind might be, or is going to be, or will be, or whatever it might be. Okay, so in terms of the role of the teacher, these are the areas I'm going to cover, and I'm going to cover them fairly quickly because I'm trying to do what might be an entire module on an MA ELT course in the next 30 minutes. So here's your master's module on fluency, plus the practical suggestions which you wouldn't get on a master's module. Let's see how we get on with it. It's going to have to be quite fast. First of all, task selection. When it comes to fluency activities, when it comes to any activity, really, we know that most teachers at all levels of experience tend to select activities which they're going to use in class because they think this will work. You know, this will work. I've done this before. This will work, or this looks as though it might work. The criteria for what might work is often not explicit. And when it comes to fluency activities, the most common reason for selecting something that might work is because it seems to appeal on a topical basis to what you know about the students in the class. So we tend to select fluency activities because there's some kind of topical relationship to what we know about the students' interests. Now, I'm not suggesting this is wrong, but it's quite interesting how often we do get it wrong and how topics which seemingly have no relationship whatsoever to the interests of the class can actually work very well. As an example of this, one of the one of the activities which I've used over the years, which I got from an Oxford supplementary skills book published in 1986, I think it was, called Oxford Supplementary Skills, Listening Upper Intermediate, written by Sheila Rickson. It was a text about the sex life of toads, of the common toad. I mean, it's kind of weird topic. And you wouldn't necessarily think that anyone would have any great interest in the sex life of toads, but it actually went down very well on a regular and systematic basis. So I'm just simply suggesting that we need to be a little bit careful about assuming that we can make judgments about what will appeal to our students in terms of topics. I think we see this very often by assuming, I don't know, stuff like, these students are digital natives, so they'll want to do something about social media. Well, no, that's really not a particularly profitable way of approaching it. They may simply be so fed up with the things that they're interested in that they don't want it in an English class. Who knows? What I would suggest, though, is that rather than topic, we ought to think about it in a different sense. And I think we could think about this more usefully. This is where the teacher's role comes in terms of the kind of fluency activity that we are asking them to participate in. This little list, this taxonomy of fluency tasks, I've taken from the book, which you see illustrated there by the two Neils, a book which I recommend. It's about, well, in the title, it's about task-based learning, but it's actually, it could equally be called Speaking Tasks Tried and Tested or something like that. They offer these different kinds of speaking tasks. And what matters here, what really matters, is that whatever the topic is, the type of task that the students are involved in requires a very different kind of language. I'm not talking about lexical variation, but I'm talking about the pragmatic use of language. The way that they will articulate meanings will vary enormously depending upon which of these tasks they're involved in. So my suggestion is that in terms of the teacher's role, one of the important things we do is that we ensure that over a period of time, a semester or however long the teaching block might be, that we ensure that fluency activities have a range of these different task types. There are other ways of categorizing them, but this will do as a rule of thumb. Make sure that there is a variety. Okay, moving on. When do we actually do the speaking in a classroom? Well, now I want to talk just very briefly about course books, because I've written so many of them over the years. In a course book, the communicative fluency-based speaking activity is almost always the last activity on a double-page spread. And in recent years, it's become almost systematically so. And the reason for that, or at least part of the reason for that, is that all of these course books now play by the game of learning outcomes. That is to say that after a double-page spread lesson, let's call it an hour and a half, something like that's worth of study, learners should be able to demonstrate something useful and valuable. This demonstration is usually designed to take place in the final communicative speaking activity, because all of these books claim to be communicative and fluency based, even if they're not. So the activity comes at the end. This is the one in the blue box here, whatever activity it may be. But leading into it, there's almost certainly been some kind of input through a listening task or a reading task. There's almost certainly, almost invariably, been some kind of language input, often grammatical input, but it could be lexical input, where rules and meanings have been presented, and then they've been practiced through controlled and semi-controlled practice. And the idea is that at the end of this lesson, there should be the big communicative tasks, which should be enjoyable, rewarding, related in some way to the real world, and should demonstrate to the learners that they've actually learned something from the preceding hour and a half. The problem is that when we have these tasks at the end of a lesson, they aren't actually fluency based anymore. And the reason for that is you'd have to be pretty stupid as a learner when you're asked to perform or participate in one of these tasks, not to understand that the teacher is expecting you to produce the language which has been presented and practiced in a controlled way or semi-controlled way in the activities leading up to it. So if you've just done let's say some work on present perfect, and you've then got an activity ostensibly fluency based, you'd have to be pretty slow not to realize that this is an opportunity for you to demonstrate your present perfect skills. But if it becomes a demonstration activity where you're showing off your language knowledge, your focus will inevitably be more than it should be on language forms and not on the meanings. So it ceases to be a fluency, meaning-focused task and becomes actually an accuracy-based and a form-focused task. This is the kind of fundamental problem with most of the fluency activities in course books, the fact that they're positioned at the end of a lesson where a whole pile of other stuff has been taught. My suggestion, is a simple suggestion, is if you want to make them into fluency-based speaking tasks, bring them to the beginning of the lesson. Bring them to the beginning before you've taught all of the other stuff and let students see how they get on. Or do them in a completely different lesson, a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. Chop and change, don't follow the order of the course book, because course books are all about discrete item acquisition, and this is in strong opposition to anything which is fluency based. So the timing when we actually set these tasks and get students to do it is kind of important, and it may undermine what it is we're trying to achieve. So that was my second point. The third one, and I'm getting on to more academic areas now, is the planning time for learners. It has been, I say, the references are all available in the handouts if you want to check them there. The literature here, the research literature, is really quite extensive. In terms of facilitating the improvement of a learner's fluency, accuracy, and complexity in a speaking task, the most significant thing that we can do is almost certainly to provide them with planning time. This is typically silent planning time. And the reason for this is not difficult to understand if you think about it for a second. If you are being asked to perform a communicative task in another language where your level is, let's say, anything below B2 or even below C1, think how hard it is to, first of all, to think of something interesting and relevant to say, and then to say it in another language. My language skills are limited in a variety of languages. There are languages like Italian where I can't say very much, but I can be really quite fluent and pretty accurate, so long as I say almost nothing at all. And I don't say anything interesting, I don't even attempt to. I get very frustrated, I'm simply not making the progress. But in order to make that progress, I would need to be trying to express, to articulate more complex meanings that I really want to articulate, rather than just saying brava or something simplistic of that kind. In order for us to do this, the question is referred to as one of the problem of cognitive load. We typically don't have enough processing capacity to do these two things at the same time, to think about what it is you want to say, to listen to the person before you, to think of a response, an appropriate response, and in real time to come out with the response in a language which you don't control very well. The solution to this is to provide planning time for learners. And in the early experiments carried out by people like Peter Skian, even something like 2 or 3 minutes silent planning time for a speaking task had a huge impact on the quality of the language they produced subsequently, and therefore on the amount that they were likely to learn from it. I can't really overstate the importance of providing planning time. This is also perhaps a reason why it's not a good idea to leave the fluency activities until the end of a lesson. Often at the end of a lesson, we're under pressure to, get the lesson finished because the lesson's about to end. Speaking activities, when they're fluency-based, need a lot of time. And this is the first thing that they're going to need. First of all, making sure people understand what they're doing, but they'll need some time to think about it. So as an absolute minimum, 2 or 3 minutes, but I'd like to suggest some other ways in which you might take it further. The most obvious way is, just providing silent thinking time. There's no guarantee when you give students silent thinking time that they will be doing silent thinking. They could be doing silent nothing at all, but hopefully some will. That's the first. The second is possibly you may ask them to take notes. Problem with note taking is that many students will try to write down everything that they want to say in advance, so that the speaking is no longer speaking, but reading out aloud the notes. So when it comes to note taking, you'll have to think about how to train your students to do this. They'll need training over at least a period of 4 or 5 separate lessons so that they do understand clearly what you mean by note taking. And this probably means things like keywords and nothing more. Don't allow people to write complete sentences. So note taking would be another possibility. Brainstorming, obviously, if we're going to start with silent thinking time, it may make sense to then put students into pairs or into small groups, 3, 4, and they brainstorm together, and they may again be scribbling down some notes or some keywords while they're doing it. So you start adding these things together, you see we're taking some time, making it worthwhile. It may also be that they need to spend some time doing topic research. It depends on the kind of task. But if it's a discussion task, especially if it's a meaty discussion task, they may well benefit from having some time, if you can do this, where they get out their phones and they use Wikipedia or Google or whatever it may be to check out what it is they want to say a little bit before they start saying it. So some sort of research, and that may involve, it depends quite a bit on their first language. It may involve looking at English language sources, and it may involve looking at resources in their own language. And I'm quite happy for them to do that, so long as they've got something to say before they try to say it in English. So topic research is another one. Mental rehearsal is another possibility. I tend to encourage students to actually move their mouths when they're doing this mental rehearsal, that they start playing around with their mouths, and you can see them go like that. But this kind of mental rehearsal may be of great value to many. It may be of particular value when it comes to phonological issues. There are words in all of the languages I've tried to learn which really cause me problems, and I just like a second or two to try and get my tongue and my speech organs around it before I try to say them. So mental rehearsal would be one. It may involve either you, the teacher, providing them with some vocabulary help, lexical help in advance, or it may be simply the case that they do this themselves. If it is a discussion task, for example, one way of going about this would be to say, well, look, if you were doing this in your own language, what words would you like to be able to use? Write them down in your own language, for me, then German. And they can do this very, very fast, write down in German 7, 10, 12 words, whatever, that they think they're going to likely need in the task which follows. And then they use bilingual online dictionaries to find out how to say these things in English. So a little bit of research of that kind is another possibility. The last suggestion, but we could go on here quite a lot longer, is that it may make sense to provide useful language support. So it might be that these are key phrases, depends again on the task. I mean, if it's a dialogue task, some key phrases may be useful. If it's a more discursive task, some key phrases, again, useful, how to get the conversation back onto track, how to interrupt somebody, these kinds of phrases may be very helpful. There are books which provide this kind of language support in a systematic way based on corpus research. I don't want to make any recommendations there, but there are books which have lists of these kinds of functions. So planning time, absolutely crucial. I move on. The next big area, which has been very, very widely researched, at least by academics, but not so much in action research, is the idea of task repetition. Task repetition is interesting. Often, we get students to do something, and then when it's done, and we finish, or we move on to something else. The probability, however, is that if they do the task again, they will learn something very differently from it the second time they do it. Not least because the cognitive load has been lessened. One of the ways that I set up preparation in advance, it might sound very weird, is that students work in pairs and I get them to do the task first in their shared language, German, or whatever it might be. And what, we're doing it in German? This is in English. Like, yep, but just trust me. So they'll do it together in their own language. Then we repeat the task with a different partner, and they have to do it in English this time. So this is qualitatively not really all that different from doing it in English together, first of all, and then turning around and working with another partner and repeating it with somebody else. Cognitive load is lessened by doing it a second time. You have an opportunity to, first of all, automatize, proceduralize the language which you've already been using. You have a chance to experiment more. There are likely to be more learning gains by repeating it with different partners. So, as I say, this has been widely researched. And in terms of the research that's been done, what the researchers are looking at are gains in language acquisition. What they're not looking at is how a student might feel about being asked to repeat a task. Because of course, you've done something once, and being asked to do it again can be boring, it can be demotivating. So the challenge for a teacher is not just to promote language acquisition, but it's to maintain motivation, engagement, alertness. And so we need to find ways of doing this which are fun and motivating. So yeah, you can do it by simply turning around, looking at somebody different. We could get people moving around the classroom if that's possible. We could have it as a mingle. If it's on Zoom, we could certainly do it with a random reshuffle of breakout rooms and find out what's going on there. But we need to do something to change the partners. One of the most common approaches to this for many, many years now is the pyramid approach, where you start with students working in pairs, first of all. And then once they've reached some kind of conclusion with their dyad partner, their pair, then they build up into fours, and then the fours build up into eights, and then we lead towards some kind of whole class discussion. I've never yet had a situation where this hasn't worked and where people have got bored. So it's an old tried and true technique and worth remembering. And again, it does lend itself quite well to Zoom, fortunately. And they just get on with it. You arrange them to relocate them to the different rooms, and then you pretend to be monitoring or not, however you feel like it. All right, a few more. Different roles. I mean, in some cases, in role plays especially, there's an A and a B, and you can simply flip it around. Okay, do it again, but this time you're B and this time you're A. But there are other roles which are possible. One that I've used quite often is a language monitor. So this time they're working in groups of 3 rather than simply pairs. And the language monitor has as a job simply the job of writing down any problems that the other pair had in trying to express their ideas. At the end of the activity, then there is an opportunity to discuss these problems and find solutions. It might be that there's a chair, it might be a note taker, it could be there's somebody just keeping time and making sure that they don't overrun their allotted time. And that's time when I should check my clock. So we can do it by changing roles to a certain extent. How else? We can do it by changing the time limits. A very well-known technique for speaking is called the 4-3-2 technique. I don't know where this originated. It's been particularly promoted by people like Paul Nation. And the idea here is that we give a time limit of, let's say, 4 minutes the first time that students do a task. They finish it and you say, fine, well done, some kind of feedback. And then you ask them to repeat the task, but tell them that this time they'll only have 3 minutes. And then when it's completed after 3 minutes, we do it again, and this time they have only 2 minutes. I mean, you can play around with the exact times. It could be 5, 4, 2, or whatever, but 4-3-2 is how it's often referred to. By having to do things again in a different time frame, you're going to have different demands on your cognitive load. But hopefully, well, the idea is, at any rate, once you've sorted out the content of what you're saying, you should be able, in the shorter time span, to make greater use of your grammatical knowledge because grammatical knowledge allows much more economic expression of meaning, rather than just using words. So we can see greater complexity coming when they're encouraged to reduce the amount of time they have. Try it out. Other suggestions, well, a time delay. I mean, why not repeat a task? If you do one of these tasks at the beginning of the lesson, repeat it at the end. If you have done it at the end, then take a break and do it at the beginning of the next lesson, or wait 3 lessons or 4 lessons and then do it again. If you want students to have any sense of progress, some kind of task repetition is, I think, it's going to be needed. It's the obvious way to do it. And it may well be that you can repeat the same task beginning of a semester or a course, and then do something very, very similar at the end, and see, how did you get on? We could ask them to repeat the task without using any notes the second time, if they've used notes the first time. We could give them some additional planning time, so they perform a task first of all, and then say, right, okay, fine. I'm going to give you another 3 or 4 minutes now to think about it, and then we're going to do it again with a different partner. So putting the planning time in the middle of a task will change it as well, and change the way they act out the repetition. We may play around with the extent to which L1 is used. It might be, for example, especially if you have a class that's basically monolingual and monocultural, it may well make sense for all sorts of reasons to allow them to use a certain amount of code switching, translanguaging, the first time that they do it. So when they struggle saying everything in English, the target language, who cares? Fine, just say it however you want to say it. Stick in phrases from your own language if you feel you need to. Maybe when we repeat it, we take that proper way. So the extent to which we allow or promote or encourage the use of L1 will also affect things. Final suggestion, although this is rather more work, but of course this is made much easier when we're using things like Zoom, where we can record, is when they participate in a task, we record it. We take some time out, they watch the recording, and possibly with feedback, and then they do it again. So there are a huge number of ways in which we can promote task repetition, and rather than just doing the task once, there's likely to be more learning gains when it's repeated in various ways, so long as it doesn't demotivate. Right, feedback. My time is running out, and feedback is perhaps the single biggest area. It's probably the biggest area in second language acquisition research. Every year, there are probably in the region of 3 or 4 new single volumes devoted entirely to feedback in English language teaching. There will be any number of journals talking about feedback. It's been going on and on and on and on and on for not years, but centuries. The earliest recorded debate I have found about feedback, and by feedback, the big question is to correct or not to correct. The earliest instance I can find is in the 16th century, and it was an Italian teacher of Greek and Latin who was teaching at the University of Ferrara in the early days of the University of Ferrara. And his basic argument was that, correction serves very little function. What learners need is just exposure to lots and lots and lots of examples of good language. This guy was well, continental-wide famous at the time, but his work was put into posterity by his son, who got it all wrong. And when his son wrote the book about his father's approach, he completely twisted it all around, and he promoted the idea that we need to correct it all. If you don't stamp out mistakes as soon as they appear, they will become fossilized. He didn't use that word, and the learners will never get any better. So it's been going for at least 500 years, and to be honest, the debate is never really going to go away. Here are the big questions. It's to correct or not to correct. Should we give feedback immediately or should we delay it? What kind of errors should the teacher give feedback on if we're talking about error correction? Should it be implicit or should it be explicit? And how should we incorporate positive feedback? We don't really have any clear answers from the research to any of these, but here are a few insights. In terms of to correct or not to correct, the work of Krashen and others who followed him is still extremely influential. He wrote back in the 1980s, corrective feedback is a waste of space, mate. That's basically his line. And he was kind of took a very sensitive line towards it. And I think that this is still widely repeated in training courses in some contexts. But Krashen, of course, is not a Delphic oracle. We have moved on, and there has been a huge amount of research since then. And the consensus, I think this is now the consensus, is that correction is moderately beneficial, not massively so, but it does have some long-term value. I'm sure that Stephen Crashton would take issue with me saying that this is the consensus. You'll have to check it out yourself and find out, but I think this is the consensus. So it's not a question now of never correcting errors. It's more a question of how and when and why. A further consideration is that when we ask students across all age ranges and across all contexts, on the whole, most students say that they want corrective feedback and they expect it. How much they want and how much they expect varies, but on the whole, they want it. And that may be a reason anyway to correct it. It may be too that actually our students aren't quite as sensitive as we sometimes think they are. They know that the social roles in the classroom permit the teacher to correct. That's what the teacher's paid for partly, and they expect it. And if you don't correct, you may well get complaints, as I did as a director of studies, from a number of students who said the teacher doesn't correct me enough. So a basic answer then is, should we correct or not correct? Well, let's not correct perhaps as much as some of us do, but let's not rule it out altogether. Should we give feedback immediately when an error has been made, or should we wait? Most teachers prefer to wait, and they will correct errors during a speaking activity and do some kind of error correction focus at the end of the task. And they do this because they feel that they don't want to break up the flow of speaking. They're worried about the motivational impact of correction. And fine, absolutely fine. Researchers, on the other hand, are not really terribly interested in the motivational side of things. They're interested in the psycholinguistic changes that take place. And so researchers have focused much more on providing on what happens when feedback is immediate. And there would seem to be a consensus among researchers that immediate feedback is likely to lead to more learning gains than delayed feedback. So it kind of counters what teachers tend to do automatically. But I think we should take this with some skepticism, because the questions about upsetting a student in mid-flow or disrupting the dynamic of an activity are things which clearly matter to us enormously. And if we disrupt too often, the likelihood is that these tasks will simply crumble and dry up. So should feedback be immediate or delayed? My suggestion would be that if you systematically do delayed feedback with a correction slot at the end, experiment with some immediate feedback. Try it out a few times and see how different individuals and different classes respond. If you systematically correct immediately, as many of the teachers I work with in Slovakia do, it's kind of part of the culture here, my recommendation is back off and do more delayed feedback. So I think it's just a question of experimenting and seeing what's going to work in different contexts without me being able to provide any research-informed answer to the question. There's been a lot of discussion about which errors we should focus on. And this is very, very problematic. In a sense, it's self-evident. Do we correct slips, performance errors, or competency errors? Well, there's no point correcting something which is complex, which students don't know already. That requires some teaching. And it's highly unlikely that the correction will make any difference at all. But it's not always easy to know whether something is a slip or it's something which is a gap in their knowledge. And in the middle of a lesson, when there's so much else for you to think about, as a teacher, how often could you accurately say, that was a performance error, or that was a competence error? It's much, much harder half the time than it would seem. So yeah, obviously, performance rather than competence, slips rather than deep-rooted problems, if you can identify them. There is another categorization, global errors, where the communication breaks down, or local errors. Yes, again, clearly it makes more sense to focus on global errors when communication breaks down, but it's actually harder to provide feedback on what's gone wrong when the communication is broken down, because you don't know what they're trying to say. And local errors, which make little difference to communication, let's say third person singular S. Do we want to correct these or not? Well, actually, probably not, because it makes very, very little difference, it would seem, in terms of learning, whether we correct them or not. They will be sorted out at some point, although you may need to correct them so you don't get students complaining you don't correct enough. That's another issue. So global rather than local, but you may have to balance that a little bit. But a bigger area, or an easy area, is this question of grammar or vocabulary or phonology. When it comes to spoken communication, breakdowns in communication happen far more often because of lexical problems or phonological problems than they do because of grammatical problems. So communication breakdowns are far more likely to be lexical or phonological than grammatical. And interestingly, the research would seem to suggest that it's much easier for learners to learn from feedback on lexical and phonological areas than on grammar. This is often because the grammar areas are big things. You know, you get feedback, you get corrected. Yeah, but what am I supposed to do about it? I still struggle. Is it present perfect, simple, or continuous? Ooh, hard. So I think there is a concrete lesson here, and that is that when we are giving corrective feedback on speaking, we should, by and large, ignore grammatical issues and focus predominantly on lexical and phonological issues. That's my big takeaway tip on this one, for the two reasons. One, because vocabulary and phonology lead to more breakdown, and two, people will learn from it more. So there is something concrete coming out of the research here. Should feedback be explicit or explicit? Again, there seems to be a difference between what teachers do and what researchers are interested in. Teachers tend to be kind of, on the whole, they tend to be softly about this. They prefer to, I don't know, little prompts saying, they'll go up to the point in the utterance where there was some kind of error, and then have rising intonation. I went at, or something like, when they're looking for I went to. So we tend to go for prompts rather than simply providing the correct form. The most explicit kind of correction is giving the correct form and explaining the reason. The research here is not entirely clear. Researchers are much more interested in reformulated so-called correct utterances than anything else. And they tend to be recommended more strongly than the kinds of prompts that we as teachers do. But the research is not clear about this, and I don't think that we can really say with any certainty at all that it's better to be direct or indirect, to be implicit or explicit. It's going to depend on the class, it's going to depend on individuals within the class, it's going to depend on the kind of error, and it's going to depend on you, how you feel about doing it. So this is a big question, been debated massively, but no clear answers. Another one which has got some very big answers, however, is the positive feedback issue. John Hattie's work, Visible Learning, has become incredibly popular in the last 15 years since he published it, where he attempted to categorize all of the things that a school or a teacher can do in terms of what he calls effect sizes. What has a positive effect on learning and what doesn't? And he came up with these wonderful tables listing effect sizes. Now, I don't want to get into the question about the extent to which this is reliable, because it's a big issue. But one of the things that Hattie identified was that feedback was one of the most significant factors influencing learning. Feedback, the quality of feedback. And without quality feedback, less learning takes place. What's interesting about this finding, and it kind of corroborates what we feel already, is that positive feedback has more impact on learning than negative feedback. Most teachers do use a lot of praise. Maybe they don't always use it in quite the same way, but praise seems to have more impact on learning than criticism. It's the first point. So in this sense, perhaps we might be thinking, well, how much corrective feedback do we want to actually give? The second point is that feedback, in order to be valuable for learning, needs to be very specific. There's no point saying to somebody, oh, you did well, or that was good, or whatever. You need to say what exactly they did well. So rather than saying something, oh, you had some good accurate grammar there, give specific examples of what they did well, what you think they did well. So giving examples of accurate or appropriate language use is, it would seem, a much more powerful learning technique than any kind of correction of things that people got wrong, whatever you want to call it. And I think that the challenge here is that as teachers, we're so kind of used to listening to language production and listening for errors. It's easy for us to spot errors. It's actually much harder for us to spot more sophisticated instances of language use. It's much harder, for example, to identify an appropriate lexical item than an inappropriate one. I think we need to train ourselves to do this. So positive feedback, more valuable than negative, but it needs to be very, very specific. And we'll need to train ourselves how to do that. Again, one of the things that I like, again, it sounds like I'm being positive. One of the things I like about being online is that when it's recorded, I can listen back again and actually be much, much more specific in the kinds of notes that I'm taking in the positive feedback. So this requires us to monitor speaking activities in a pretty diligent way, and it's not easy. And simply walking out of the room, as used to happen back in the 1990s, or as still happens now occasionally when we're pretending to be monitoring a breakout room, we're not. Monitoring is a central part of our job. Even if we don't actually act on that feedback, we do need to know what's going on. Although there may be times when it is best just to leave people alone. So, monitoring. Perhaps the most significant thing of all is the supportive manner. I mean, I guess this doesn't really need stating. Most of us know that we need to be supportive, encouraging. We need to do what we can to facilitate and encourage positive feedback from peers. And the last point, again, is perhaps one of the most important, and that is when we give feedback, if the activity is a fluency-based activity with a focus on meaning, we need to give feedback on the content of what people said, not just the language they used to express it. So if somebody says something interesting, let's give them feedback. That was interesting, what you said. Okay, good. In a traditional class or even in an online class, it may be worth saying, I heard somebody say this, which I thought was interesting. Could you repeat it to the whole class so we can all hear it? It was interesting. And I think the flip side to this is when we are going to be negative, let's not be negative about errors. Let's be negative about crap content. When people are simply talking rubbish, let's pick up on it. Hang on. What you said something which I thought I couldn't agree with less. Let's pick up on these kind of issues and have real discussions about it. If we have instances of extreme non-inclusive behavior in a classroom, let's not just tolerate it. Let's deal with it. So let's have positive feedback on the content when it's appropriate and negative when it's not. Right, let's finish. The last big area which has been researched is the area of, I call it reflection, but we could call this metacognition. There is a generally held research view that all learning activities become richer when we reflect on them afterwards. The same is true of speaking activities. This particular example, Keeping a Speaking Diary, is from a book by Christine Gohan and Burns, where on a systematic basis, we encourage students to reflect on how they feel about the speaking activities they've been involved in. And in this case, it's keep a diary, but it could be simply a quick discussion at the end. This is metacognitive work. And the research is fairly clear that this should and does lead to gains of various kinds. My only issue with it is that when I try it, it's very rare that I have classes that want to participate in this kind of activity. Now, maybe I'm just not selling it well enough, but I've actually had problems pushing this idea across, maybe because people pick up on my own skepticism. I'm not really quite sure what the reason is. And without exception, classes that I've taught would rather just get on with the speaking activity rather than having a speaking activity about the speaking activity. But that's my experience. It's perhaps a relatively limited experience, and it's certainly conditioned by the kinds of classes that I've had over the years. And certainly my experience would seem to be counter to what researchers seem to be saying. So I bring it up. I express personal reservations because I need to do so, and leave you to try it out yourselves. Specific examples of these things can be found in these handouts that I gave you. So that was my quick rattle through. I appreciate that that was fairly fast, but you can take your time to digest the handouts if you wish. And certainly, I haven't been looking at the chat. If Lizzie, you've picked up anything on the chat which you want to throw back at me, then I could try to answer a question or two.
Thank you, Philip. That was amazing. I feel like we all deserve 20 postgraduate learning credits now.
It's not actually complicated, the research. It's not rocket science.
No, but I really enjoyed sort of thinking about all the questions that we ask all the time, certainly in training courses, and that trainees have to think through, and to think, okay, my instinct is this, and this is what the research says. So it's been amazing to compare those. So thank you for doing all that reading for our benefit, so that we don't have to. So yeah, brilliant.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a role. I mean, that's kind of my role more and more, is acting as a mediator between the research community and the teaching community. There are other people like Scott. You know, he's the master par excellence of that kind of mediation, although he has done research as well. But yeah, you don't want to spend your life reading these journals. It's no, leave it to a few other people.